the Vatican a sovereign citadel of faith, power, and secrets. For nearly 2 millennia, the Holy See has stood as the epicenter of Catholic doctrine, withering storms of heresy, Reformation, and modernity. Yet beneath the magnificent domes and behind the gilded altars lies a more complex relationship with the Divine One, marked by fear, not fear of Satan, whose temptations were familiar and whose tactics were documented in countless theological treatises. No, what truly terrified the guardians of the faith was something far more insidious: prophecy, the unpredictable, uncontrollable voice that claimed to speak directly from God, bypassing the carefully constructed hierarchy of papal authority. The roots of this apprehension reach back to the very foundations of Christianity. The early church emerged from a world steeped in prophetic tradition. The Hebrew prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, had long delivered messages directly from Yahweh, often challenging kings and priests alike. Jesus himself was seen as fulfilling these ancient prophecies, and the early Christian communities were awash with charismatic figures claiming divine revelation. The earliest Christians operated in a spiritual atmosphere where prophecy was considered a gift of the Holy Spirit. Paul's letters mention prophecy as one of the charisms or spiritual gifts bestowed upon believers. There was this sense that God spoke directly to individuals, regardless of their position in the developing church hierarchy. By the 2nd century, tensions had already emerged. In Roman Asia Minor, a charismatic movement known as Montanism swept through Christian communities. Its founder, Montanus, along with 2 female prophets, Priscilla and Maximilla, claimed to speak with the direct voice of the Holy Spirit, pronouncing new revelations and a more rigorous asceticism. For the developing Orthodox Church, this movement presented an existential threat. If anyone could claim direct revelation from God, what need was there for bishops or a centralized authority? The response was swift and decisive. The suppression of Montanism represents one of the first systematic efforts by church authorities to control prophetic expression. They established a principle that would define the church's approach to prophecy for centuries to come. Revelation was closed with the apostolic age. Any new prophecies had to be subject to the discernment and authority of the established church. But the impulse toward prophecy could not be so easily extinguished. As Christianity evolved from a persecuted sect to the official religion of the Roman Empire, the tension between institutional control and prophetic charisma intensified. By the medieval period, this conflict had taken on new dimensions. The early Middle Ages witnessed a surge in apocalyptic expectation. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire, waves of plague, and constant warfare created fertile ground for prophecies of the end times. In this atmosphere of anxiety, the 12th century Calabrian abbot Joachim of Fiore developed one of the most influential prophetic systems in Christian history. Joachim divided history into 3 ages: the age of the Father, corresponding to the Old Testament; the age of the Son, represented by the New Testament and the institutional church; and the coming age of the Holy Spirit, which would transcend ecclesiastical structures and usher in a utopian spiritual society. What made Joachim's prophecies so threatening was their theological sophistication. He wasn't some uneducated visionary easily dismissed as a heretic. He was a respected abbot who had received papal approval for his monastic order. Yet his prophetic system implied that the institutional church was merely a transitional phase, in divine history destined to be superseded. Though Joachim himself remained loyal to Rome, his ideas spawned numerous movements that challenged papal authority. The spiritual Franciscans, in particular, adopted and radicalized Joachimite prophecies, identifying the papacy with the Antichrist and predicting its imminent downfall. The Vatican's response was to further centralize prophetic interpretation. Pope Boniface VIII's bull Unum Sanctam in 1302 represented a high water mark of papal claims to absolute authority, both temporal and spiritual. The message was clear: there could be no divine revelation outside the Church's control. Yet even as the papacy consolidated its power, it could not escape the shadow of prophecy. Indeed, some of the most troubling prophetic traditions emerged from within the Church itself. In the darkened corners of monasteries and convents across Europe, visionaries received disturbing messages that seemed to predict calamity for the institution they served. St. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German Benedictine abbess, experienced mystical visions that she recorded in works like Civius. Though officially sanctioned by the Church, Pope Eugenius III personally endorsed her visionary writings. Hildegard's prophecies contained disturbing elements. She foresaw a period of corruption within the Church that would necessitate a purging. Fire of reform. Such messages, even from a canonized saint, set uneasily with Vatican authorities. The pattern would repeat itself throughout the medieval period. Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, and other mystics received divine messages that often contained implicit or explicit critiques of ecclesiastical corruption. These holy men and women walked a precarious line venerated for their sanctity, yet scrutinized for the content of their revelations. The Church developed an elaborate system for testing spirits and discerning the authenticity of visions. But this process was invariably political. Prophecies that aligned with papal interests might be endorsed, while equally credible visions that challenged the status quo faced suppression or reinterpretation. This selective approach to prophecy became increasingly difficult to maintain during the tumultuous 14th and 15th centuries. The Avignon Papacy, 1309 to 1376, and subsequent Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, when multiple men simultaneously claimed the papal throne, dealt a severe blow to the Church's authority. In this atmosphere of institutional crisis, prophetic voices proliferated, many predicting the downfall of a corrupted papacy. The Great Western Schism, when up to 3 rival popes simultaneously claimed St. Peter's throne, seemed to fulfill these dark prophecies. Christianity was divided, with nations, religious orders, and theological faculties pledging allegiance to different pontiffs. The very institution meant to guarantee spiritual unity had become a source of unprecedented division. During this period, prophecies about papal succession gained particular potency. The mysterious prophecy of the popes, attributed to the 12th century Irish bishop St. Malachi, purported to list cryptic mottos for every pope from Celestine II, 1143, until the end of time. Though most scholars now consider this document a 16th century forgery, its impact on the papal imagination was significant. Each conclave was shadowed by speculation about whether the next pontiff would fulfill Saint Malachi's ominous predictions. Even more troubling to Vatican authorities were prophecies emerging from within the papal court itself. In the late 13th century, a spiritual movement known as the Fratelli Radical Franciscans, who insisted on absolute poverty, embraced apocalyptic prophecies that identified the institutional church with the whore of Babylon described in the Book of Revelation. Despite brutal suppression, these ideas persisted in underground currents throughout the late medieval period. Perhaps most disturbing to the papal court were the visions of saints whose sanctity could not be denied. The 14th century mystic Birgitta of Sweden, later canonized as Saint Bridget, received revelations that explicitly condemned corrupt popes and bishops. In one vision, Christ himself declared that a pope who abused his office was a murderer of souls, worse than Judas and more unjust than Pilate. Such words, coming from a woman renowned for her holiness, could not be easily dismissed. The Vatican strategy evolved toward containment rather than outright suppression. Officially approved visionaries were kept under close supervision, often attached to established religious orders that could monitor and channel their prophetic utterances. Their more controversial prophecies might be reinterpreted or quietly set aside, while their less challenging messages were promoted. By the late medieval period, the papacy had developed a sophisticated approach to prophecy, embracing certain prophetic traditions while ruthlessly suppressing others. This delicate balancing act would be severely tested by the coming storms of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. As Europe entered the early modern era, the battle between institutional control and prophetic charisma was about to reach unprecedented intensity. Deep within the Vatican's secret archives, behind layers of security and centuries of accumulated dust, lie manuscripts that few eyes have ever beheld. These are not merely rare books or ancient documents. They are texts that were deemed too dangerous for the faithful to encounter, prophecies considered too volatile for public consumption. Their very existence reveals a Vatican deeply troubled by the power of prophetic words. The story of these forbidden manuscripts begins long before the Vatican. Archives were established. In the early church, texts considered heretical or dangerous were systematically destroyed. Emperor Constantine's edict following the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE ordered the burning of Arian writings, establishing a precedent for suppressing dissenting theological views. As the Church consolidated its power in the following centuries, this approach expanded to include prophetic texts that challenged ecclesiastical authority. By the medieval period, the Church had developed more sophisticated methods of controlling dangerous texts. Rather than destroying them outright, certain manuscripts were sequestered in monastic libraries, accessible only to scholars with official permission, typically those tasked with refuting heretical ideas. This practice evolved into what we now know as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, list of prohibited books, formally established in 1559, but reflecting centuries of earlier practice. Among the most closely guarded manuscripts were apocalyptic texts predicting the end of the world, or the downfall of the Church. The Vatican's anxiety about such prophecies was not merely spiritual, it was practical. History had repeatedly shown that apocalyptic expectations could fuel revolutionary movements with very real political consequences. Consider the case of the Codex Vaticanus Latinus 3819, a collection of prophecies attributed to Joachim of Fiore, but actually compiled by his followers in the 13th century. These texts predicted a new age of spiritual enlightenment that would render the institutional church obsolete. When these ideas spread among the spiritual Franciscans, they contributed to a movement that directly challenged papal authority and property. Pope John XXII responded by declaring these Joachimite prophecies heretical in 1326 and ordering the arrest of Franciscans who adhered to them. The Vatican Library, itself established formally in 1475 by Pope Sixtus IV, contained a special section known as the Inferno, where forbidden books were kept under lock and key. Access was granted only to select scholars with explicit papal permission, typically for the purpose of writing refutations. Among these forbidden texts were numerous prophetic manuscripts deemed too dangerous for general circulation. One such manuscript was the notorious Vaticina de Summis Pontificibus, Prophecies of the Supreme Pontiff, a series of illustrated prophecies about future popes that circulated in various forms from the 13th century onward. These enigmatic images and texts seemed to predict corruption and eventual destruction within the papacy itself. Church authorities collected and sequestered as many copies as possible, concerned about their potential to undermine papal legitimacy. The infamous Prophecy of the Popes, attributed to Saint Malachi, was another text that caused considerable consternation within Vatican circles, purporting to list and describe every pope from the 12th century until the end of time. It ends with the final pope, Peter the Roman, during whose reign Rome would be destroyed, and a terrible judge would condemn the people. Though most scholars now consider it a 16th century forgery, the Vatican took it seriously enough to restrict access to official copies. Even more disturbing to church authorities were private revelations from visionaries whose sanctity had been officially recognized. Saint Hildegard of Bingen Sivias contained passages prophesying a great tribulation, during which clergy would be violently persecuted for their corruption. Saint Bridget of Sweden recorded visions in which Christ and the Virgin Mary delivered scathing critiques of papal avarice and worldliness. These texts could not be dismissed as heretical, coming as they did from canonized saints, yet their contents threatened to undermine respect for ecclesiastical office. The Vatican's solution was often to control access to the original texts, while promoting carefully edited versions. Saint Bridget's revelations, for instance, circulated in versions that emphasized her devotional visions while downplaying her harsh criticisms of the clergy. Similar editorial control was exerted over the writings of Catherine of Siena and other mystics whose prophecies contained uncomfortable elements. The development of the printing press in the 15th century dramatically changed the landscape of information control. Suddenly, text could be reproduced and distributed at unprecedented speed and volume. The Vatican responded by intensifying its efforts to control prophetic literature. In 1559, Pope Paul IV established the first official index of prohibited books, which included numerous prophetic and apocalyptic texts deemed dangerous to the faith. One striking example is the case of Guillaume Pasteur, a 16th century French scholar and visionary who gained access to Kabbalistic prophecies and integrated them with Christian apocalyptic traditions. His works predicted a coming age of universal harmony that would transcend existing religious institutions. Though initially welcomed at the Vatican because of his linguistic skills, Apostle's prophetic writings led to his imprisonment by the Roman Inquisition. His manuscripts were confiscated and sequestered in what would later become the Vatican secret archives. The Counter-Reformation period saw increased vigilance against prophetic texts, particularly those emerging from Protestant circles. Works like John Fox's Acts and Monuments, which interpreted history as the fulfillment of biblical prophecies about papal corruption, were strictly prohibited in Catholic territories. Meanwhile, Catholic prophetic traditions were subjected to increasingly rigorous scrutiny by the Congregation of the Holy Office, the Roman Inquisition. Despite these efforts, prophetic manuscripts continued to circulate clandestinely. The 17th century saw the emergence of elaborate coded systems for sharing forbidden prophecies. One notable example is the Pasquino, a statue in Rome that regularly featured anonymously posted prophetic verses criticizing papal policies. These talking statues became a mechanism for circumventing Vatican censorship, with prophecies posted under cover of darkness and copied by sympathetic scribes before Vatican guards could remove them. The Vatican secret archives contain numerous records of investigations into such prophetic movements. One particularly extensive file concerns the crypto-Joachimites of 17th century southern Italy, who preserved and circulated forbidden manuscripts predicting the imminent end of the papacy and the dawn of a new spiritual age. Vatican agents infiltrated these circles, confiscated manuscripts, and interrogated members, adding detailed reports to the ever-growing collection of suppressed prophetic materials. Perhaps the most tantalizing documents in the Vatican archives are those related to Nostradamus. The 16th century French physician and astrologer published his enigmatic prophecies in 1555, containing hundreds of quatrains purporting to predict future events. While never officially condemned by the Church, certain manuscripts containing interpretations of Nostradamus that specifically targeted the papacy were quietly collected and removed from circulation by Vatican agents. Lesser known but equally intriguing case involves the prophecies of Madre Jeronima de la Fuente, a 17th century Spanish mystic who predicted a period when the throne of Peter will stand empty, while false shepherds lead the flock astray. Her manuscripts were confiscated by the Spanish Inquisition and eventually transferred to Rome, where they remain under restriction to this day. The pattern continued into the modern era. The 19th century witnessed a surge in Marian apparitions appearances of the Virgin Mary, delivering messages often apocalyptic in nature. While some, like the apparitions of Lourdes, received official approval, others faced skepticism or outright suppression. The visionaries of Les Salites in 1846 reported receiving secret messages from Mary concerning a coming crisis in the Church and the appearance of the Antichrist. The Vatican intervened to suppress publication of these more controversial elements, though versions continued to circulate underground. By the early 20th century, the most famous case of controlled prophecy involved the Third Secret of Fatima. In 1917, 3 Portuguese children reported visions of the Virgin Mary, who entrusted them with 3 secrets. The third, written down by visionary Lucia dos Santos, was sent to the Vatican with instructions that it be revealed in 1960. When Pope John the 23rd read the contents, he decided not to release the text, stating that it did not concern his pontificate. The secret remained unpublished until 2000, fueling decades of speculation about its contents. The Vatican's relationship with prophetic manuscripts reveals a consistent pattern across centuries, neither complete suppression nor full acceptance, but rather a careful strategy of containment. Prophecies aligned with church interests might be promoted, while threatening predictions were sequestered, reinterpreted, or relegated to obscurity in the depths of the secret archives. This strategy reflects a fundamental anxiety at the heart of the Vatican's approach to prophecy, the fear that direct divine revelation, unmediated by ecclesiastical authority, poses an existential threat to the Church's hierarchical structure. In the battle between institutional control and prophetic charisma, the forbidden manuscripts stand as silent witnesses to an unresolved tension at the core of Catholic history. The fundamental tension between prophecy and institutional religion lies not in their opposition, but in their uncomfortable similarity. Both claim to convey divine truth. Both seek to guide humanity according to heavenly wisdom. Yet their methods and authorities exist in uneasy parallel, and therein lies the source of the Vatican's deepest anxieties about prophecy. Christianity was born in prophecy. Jesus himself was recognized as fulfilling ancient Hebrew prophecies, and his early followers experienced the ecstatic phenomenon of speaking in tongues at Pentecost, a manifestation of prophetic spirit. The earliest Christian communities featured prophets alongside apostles and teachers, with prophecy considered a spiritual gift, charisma, bestowed by the Holy Spirit. The transition from charismatic community to institutional church created an inherent tension that is never fully resolved. As ecclesiastical structures solidified, with bishops claiming apostolic succession and authority, the unmediated voice of prophecy became increasingly problematic. How could the Church maintain its position as the sole authentic interpreter of divine will if God continued to speak directly through prophets outside the hierarchy? The Vatican solution, developed over centuries, was to establish itself as the ultimate arbiter of prophetic authenticity. Prophecy itself would not be rejected. Such a position would contradict Scripture and tradition, but would be subjected to ecclesiastical discernment and control. This approach was codified in the 1978 Vatican document, Norms, regarding the manner of proceeding in the discernment of presumed apparitions or revelations, which established strict criteria for evaluating claimed supernatural phenomena. This system of prophetic authentication reveals the Church's fundamental concern, maintaining its mediating role between God and humanity. Approved prophecies must explicitly acknowledge ecclesiastical authority and can add nothing substantial to the deposit of faith already entrusted to the Church. In essence, authentic prophecy by Vatican standards cannot challenge the institution's primacy. The theological justification for this position rests on the doctrine of the closure of public revelation. According to this teaching, God's self-revelation culminated in Jesus Christ and was completed with the death of the last apostle. Any subsequent private revelations, while potentially authentic, cannot add to or modify this fundamental revelation, merely call attention to aspects of it that may have been neglected. This doctrine provided the Vatican with a powerful tool for controlling prophetic expression. Prophecies deemed compatible with existing doctrine might be approved as authentic private revelations, while those containing novel theological elements could be dismissed as inauthentic or even diabolical in origin. The criteria for discernment invariably included submission to ecclesiastical authority as a necessary condition of authenticity. Yet the uncomfortable reality remained. Prophecy, by its very nature, often arises precisely when institutions have calcified or corrupted. Throughout biblical history, prophets typically emerged not to reinforce existing power structures but to challenge them, calling leadership back to authentic fidelity. This pattern created an inherent paradox. The more the institution might need prophetic correction, the more likely it would be to reject such prophecies as inauthentic. The case of St. Joan of Arc illustrates this dilemma perfectly. The young visionary claimed divine guidance through the voices of saints, leading her to unprecedented military and political actions during the 100 Years' War. Church authorities, aligned with English interests, condemned her voices as demonic and had her burned as a heretic in 1431. Yet just 25 years later, a new papal commission reversed this judgment, finding her authentic and pious. The stark reversal demonstrates how prophecy's reception often depends more on institutional interests than on consistent theological criteria. Similar patterns appear throughout church history. Maria de Agreda, a 17th century Spanish mystic, wrote The Mystical City of God based on her visions of Mary's life. The Spanish Inquisition initially approved the work, but the Roman Inquisition placed it on the index of prohibited books. After decades of theological and political struggle, the ban was lifted, and the book became widely read. Such vacillation reveals the often arbitrary nature of prophetic discernment when institutional interests are at stake. The most systematic Vatican approach to prophecy emerged in the Counter-Reformation period. As Protestant reformers claimed prophetic authority for their break with Rome, the Catholic Church intensified its efforts to control prophetic expression. The establishment of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, originally the Roman Inquisition, created an institutional mechanism for evaluating claimed revelations and prophecies. Under this system, visionaries faced intense scrutiny. Those whose prophecies reinforced Catholic doctrine against Protestant challenges might be cautiously approved, while those suggesting reform within the Church encountered suspicion or condemnation. The process typically involved lengthy investigations, psychological examinations, and theological analysis of the reported messages. Approval, when granted, often came decades or even centuries after the visionary's death, once any politically sensitive aspects of the prophecies had lost their immediate relevance. This process created a curious dynamic. The most successful Catholic prophets were often those who combined apparent supernatural phenomena with strict submission to ecclesiastical authority. Bernadette Soubirous, the Visionary of Lourdes, exemplified this model. Though initially questioned by church officials, she demonstrated perfect obedience throughout the investigation. The content of her visions focusing on prayer, penance, and Marian devotion rather than ecclesiastical criticism posed no threat to institutional interests. Her subsequent canonization established a template for the ideal Catholic visionary. Contrast this with the case of Marie-Julie Jahenny, a 19th century French stigmatic whose prophecies included warnings of apostasy within the church hierarchy and coming liturgical changes that would undermine the faith. Despite exhibiting extraordinary mystical phenomena, including the stigmata, visible communion from angels, and prolonged fasting, she never received official recognition. Her prophecies simply posed too direct a challenge to ecclesiastical authority. Pattern becomes even clearer in the Vatican's handling of Marian apparitions in the modern era. Those with messages focusing on personal conversion, increased devotion, and recognition of established Catholic doctrines like Lourdes and Fatima eventually received approval. Those containing explicit criticisms of the clergy or warnings about corruption within the church like La Salette or Akeda faced greater skepticism or had controversial elements of their messages suppressed. This selective approach to prophecy reveals the Vatican's fundamental concern, maintaining control over divine communication. Prophecy that reinforces institutional authority can be cautiously embraced. Prophecy that challenges it must be contained. This strategy has allowed the Church to incorporate prophetic charisma without surrendering institutional primacy. Theological justification for this approach rests on the concept of sensus fidelium, the idea that the Holy Spirit guides the entire Church, not just individual prophets. According to this doctrine, authentic prophecy must be discerned by the community under the guidance of its legitimate shepherds. This communal discernment provides a check against false prophecy, but also ensures that prophetic voices remain subject to institutional evaluation. Yet this solution has never fully resolved the tension. The very need for prophetic expression suggests the possibility of institutional calcification or corruption. If the Church perfectly embodied divine will at all times, there would be no need for additional prophetic intervention. The persistence of prophecy implicitly challenges the sufficiency of institutional mediation. Moreover, the history of canonized saints reveals numerous cases where individuals initially condemned or viewed with suspicion by church authorities were later recognized as authentically inspired. Padre Pio, the 20th century stigmatic, was restricted from public ministry and investigated multiple times by the Holy Office before eventually being recognized as a saint. Such reversals raise disturbing questions about the reliability of ecclesiastical discernment and suggest that institutional interests sometimes override spiritual authenticity. Perhaps the most profound challenge prophecy poses to institutional religion is epistemological. The Church claims authority based on apostolic succession and tradition, a carefully preserved chain of transmission stretching back to the apostles. Prophecy, by contrast, suggests direct, unmediated access to divine wisdom. If God can speak directly to individuals without institutional mediation, what becomes of the Church's claim to be the necessary channel of salvation? This epistemological challenge explains why the Vatican has historically been more concerned about prophecy than about moral failings or even heretical ideas. Sin and error are human problems that reinforce the need for institutional guidance. Prophecy suggests an alternative source of divine guidance that potentially renders the institution superfluous. The fundamental paradox remains unresolved. The Church must simultaneously affirm the possibility of authentic prophecy while maintaining its exclusive authority to authenticate such prophecy. This circular system ensures institutional control, but creates a troubling blind spot. If prophecy often arises precisely to correct institutional failings, how can the institution be trusted to evaluate prophecies about itself? This unresolved tension explains why prophecy has remained a persistent source of anxiety for the Vatican across centuries. Unlike demonic temptation, which reinforces the need for ecclesiastical guidance, prophecy challenges the very foundations of institutional authority by suggesting direct access to divine wisdom. In a profound sense, the Vatican has indeed feared prophecy more than the devil, because while the devil's work reinforces the Church's role as mediator, prophecy calls that very role into question. Throughout the centuries, certain visionaries have emerged whose prophecies proved so unsettling, so potentially destabilizing to the established order, that Church authorities took extraordinary measures to contain their influence. These were not raving heretics easily dismissed, but often pious, devout Catholics whose mystical experiences led them to messages that threatened the institutional Church. Their stories illuminate the Vatican's profound anxiety about uncontrolled prophecy. Medieval German mystic Mechthild of Magdeburg exemplifies this pattern. Born to a noble Saxon family around 1207, Mechthild experienced her first vision at age 12 when she reported being greeted by the Holy Spirit. She later joined the Beguines, a semi-religious community of women who lived according to religious principles but outside formal church structures. This independent status already placed her in a suspect category for church authorities. Mechthild's visions, compiled in her book The Flowing Light of the Godhead, contain passionate imagery of divine love but also scathing critiques of ecclesiastical corruption. She wrote of clergy who should be mirrors of all virtues, but instead run after money like dogs after a hare. More troublingly, she claimed direct divine authority for her writings. This book is sent by God as a new apostolic teaching. Such claims of direct divine commission represented a fundamental challenge to church authority. Mechthild's Dominican confessor initially supported her, but as her prophecies grew more critical of the institutional church, ecclesiastical approval waned. She was eventually pressured to enter a Cistercian convent where her activities could be more closely monitored. Significantly, her complete works survived only in a Latin translation that softened many of her more controversial pronouncements. The original Middle Low German text was lost or perhaps deliberately suppressed. Even more dramatic was the case of Guglielma of Milan, a 13th century woman who attracted a devoted following in Lombardy. While Guglielma herself appears to have been orthodox in her beliefs, her followers developed a radical theology after her death, claiming she was an incarnation of the Holy Spirit, who would return to usher in a new age in which the papacy would be replaced by a female pope. This Guglielmite movement, with its direct challenge to papal authority and traditional gender hierarchies, was brutally suppressed by the Inquisition in 1300. The remains of Guglielma were exhumed and burned, her followers imprisoned or executed, and all writings associated with the movement destroyed. The pattern continued into the early modern period with figures like Magdalena de la Cruz, a Franciscan abbess in 16th century Spain, initially celebrated for her extreme asceticism and mystical gifts including stigmata and levitation. Magdalena enjoyed the patronage of Emperor Charles V and wielded considerable influence. Her prophecies were sought by the highest echelons of Spanish society. Yet as her political power grew, so did ecclesiastical suspicion. In 1546, falling seriously ill, Magdalena made a shocking confession. She claimed her supernatural abilities were the result of a demonic pact. While some historians suggest this confession was coerced or resulted from mental illness brought on by her extreme fasting, the Church eagerly accepted this explanation. The alternative, that a woman had wielded genuine prophetic authority outside hierarchical control for decades, was far more threatening to institutional power than the notion of demonic deception. The 17th century brought the remarkable case of Benedetta Carlini, an Italian abbess whose mystical experiences included claims of marriage to Christ and possession by a male angel named Splenditello. While modern scholars have focused on the sexual aspects of Benedetta's case, she was accused of using her claimed spiritual possessions to engage in sexual activity with another nun. The ecclesiastical authorities of her time were equally concerned with her prophetic claims, which bypassed clerical authority. After investigation by the Church, Benedetta was stripped of her position and confined to a convent cell for the remaining 35 years of her life. All her writings were confiscated and mostly destroyed. The few documents that survive exist only in the records of her inquisitorial trial. This pattern preservation of prophetic writings only in the context of their condemnation recurs throughout church history and reveals a consistent strategy. Prophecies deemed threatening were not merely suppressed, but reframed as evidence of heresy, mental illness, or demonic influence. Perhaps the most notorious case of a prophet whose visions directly challenged church authority was that of Sister Jeanne d'Angers, prioress of the Ursuline convent in Loudun, France. In 1632, Jeanne and several other nuns claimed demonic possession, accusations that led to the infamous trial and execution of parish priest Urbain Grandier for witchcraft. While initially the case seemed to reinforce ecclesiastical authority, a priest condemned for diabolical acts, it ultimately spiraled beyond church control. After Grandier's execution, Jeanne's possessions transformed into mystical experiences, including visions of angels and saints. She embarked on a tour of France, displaying the names of Joseph and Mary that she claimed had been miraculously inscribed on her hand. Attracting enormous crowds and the patronage of powerful nobles, Jeanne effectively established her own authority, based on direct divine communication, bypassing normal ecclesiastical channels. Church authorities, recognizing the threat, eventually confined Jeanne to her convent. Her autobiography, though apparently written at the direction of her exorcist, contains elements that subtly undermine clerical authority, suggesting that her direct mystical experiences gave her spiritual insights surpassing those of her male confessors. The Vatican's anxiety about such claims is evident in how quickly Jeanne was removed from public view once her prophecies began attracting independent followings. The 18th century witnessed a prophetic movement that particularly alarmed Roman authorities, the Jansenists of Paris. Following the death of a revered Jansenist deacon, Francois de Paris, miraculous cures were reported at his tomb in the cemetery of St. Medard. More disturbing to authorities were the convulsionaires, individuals who fell into ecstatic trances, delivered prophetic utterances, and performed seemingly impossible physical feats. These prophetic manifestations occurred in a highly charged political context. The Jansenist movement stood in opposition to Jesuit influence in the Church and questioned papal authority. The convulsionaires delivered prophecies predicting divine judgment against the papacy for its condemnation of Jansenist theology. In 1732, King Louis XV ordered the cemetery closed. A famous piece of graffiti appeared on the gates. By order of the king, God is forbidden to perform miracles here. The mockery captured a fundamental irony: ecclesiastical and royal authorities attempting to control divine communication. The Vatican's response to the Jansenist prophets was twofold: public condemnation through papal bulls and secret monitoring through an extensive spy network. Reports from these informants survive in the Vatican archives, detailing the spread of prophetic utterances through underground Jansenist networks. These documents reveal the Church's profound anxiety about prophecies that explicitly challenged papal authority while claiming divine origin. The 19th century brought a surge in Marian apparitions, many with apocalyptic themes that troubled Church authorities. Among the most problematic was La Salette, where in 1846 two shepherd children claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to them with messages of doom. The seer Melanie Calvet later published an expanded version of Mary's message, including prophecies of church corruption. Wrong will lose the faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. The Church will be eclipsed. The Vatican responded by authorizing the apparition itself while attempting to suppress Melanie's more controversial prophecies. Her book was placed on the index of prohibited books, and she was pressured to leave France. She spent years wandering through Italy, England, and Greece under constant ecclesiastical surveillance. The Vatican archives contain extensive correspondence between bishops and the Holy Office regarding methods to limit the spread of her apocalyptic prophecies. Even more troubling to Church authorities was the case of Palma Maria Mattarelli, an Italian stigmatic who gained fame in the mid-19th century. Palma displayed extraordinary phenomena: bleeding wounds, subsistence on the Eucharist alone for years, bilocation, and prophecies of coming calamities for the Church. Unlike many visionaries who were uneducated peasants, Palma attracted the support of theologians and aristocrats, making her more difficult to dismiss. Particularly alarming to Vatican authorities were Palma's prophecies concerning the 3 days of darkness, a coming period when divine judgment would purge corruption from the Church hierarchy itself. These prophecies implied that the institutional Church had strayed so far from its divine mission that direct supernatural intervention was necessary to purify it, a fundamental challenge to ecclesiastical authority. The Vatican's response was to isolate Palma, restricting visitors and placing her under the supervision of bishops skeptical of her gifts. After her death, efforts were made to limit the circulation of her prophecies. Though never formally condemned, Palma's case exemplifies the Church's strategy toward prophets whose messages threaten institutional stability: containment rather than outright suppression, careful management of public access, and gradual relegation to obscurity. The early 20th century brought perhaps the most significant prophetic challenge to Vatican authority, the visions of Fatima. In 1917, 3 Portuguese children claimed to receive apparitions of the Virgin Mary with messages concerning world events and the future of the Church. The third of these messages, the famous Third Secret of Fatima, proved particularly troubling to Church authorities. According to Sister Lucia, the last surviving visionary, the Virgin instructed that this third secret be revealed to the world. In 1960, when the sealed document reached the Vatican, Pope John XXIII read it and decided not to publish it, stating only that it did not concern his pontificate. Subsequent popes maintained this secrecy until 2000, when a text was finally released, though many scholars and devotees question whether the published version represents the complete secret. The Vatican's reluctance to release the third secret generated decades of speculation. Rumors circulated that it predicted apostasy within the church hierarchy, or even the assassination of a pope. The Vatican's handling of Fatima reveals its continued anxiety about prophecies that might undermine ecclesiastical authority, even in the modern era. By controlling access to the original text and managing its interpretation, the Church maintained institutional primacy over a potentially destabilizing prophetic message. Less known, but equally intriguing, is the case of Teresa Musco, an Italian mystic who died in 1976 at age 33. Teresa allegedly received apocalyptic visions concerning coming chastisements and corruption within the Church. She was said to experience stigmata, bilocation, and the mystical substitution of suffering for others. What made her particularly troubling to Church authorities were her specific prophecies concerning liturgical changes and doctrinal confusion following the Second Vatican Council. According to witnesses, Teresa prophesied that Satan would enter the highest ranks of the Church and that priests would mislead the faithful. Such messages directly challenged the post-Vatican II ecclesiastical establishment. Though Teresa maintained formal obedience to Church authorities throughout her life, her prophecies circulated widely in traditionalist Catholic circles. After her death, the Vatican maintained a studied silence about her case, neither condemning nor endorsing her visions, a strategy of containment through institutional indifference. The pattern continues to the present day with figures like Julia Kim of Nayu, South Korea, who since 1985 has reported visions, stigmata, and Eucharistic miracles. Julia's messages frequently criticize modernistic tendencies within the Church and predict divine chastisement for doctrinal compromise. The Korean Bishops' Conference has declared her phenomena not supernatural in origin, yet her following continues to grow internationally. What unites these diverse prophetic figures across centuries is their claim to direct divine communication outside established ecclesiastical channels. Their prophecies, particularly those critical of the institutional Church, represented a fundamental challenge to the Vatican's mediating role between God and humanity. The Church's responses ranging from outright suppression to careful containment to selective endorsement reveal its persistent anxiety about uncontrolled prophecy. This anxiety was not merely theological but practical. History had repeatedly shown that prophetic movements could quickly transform into social and political forces capable of challenging established power structures. From the Montanists of the 2nd century to the traditionalist seers of the post-Vatican II era, prophets who bypassed ecclesiastical authority, while claiming divine inspiration, represented an existential threat to the Church's hierarchical model. The Vatican's sophisticated strategies for managing this threat, developing elaborate processes for authenticating visions, controlling access to original prophetic texts, and carefully monitoring visionaries, reveal just how seriously it took the challenge of prophecy. For an institution claiming to be the authoritative interpreter of divine revelation, nothing was more threatening than the suggestion that God might speak directly to the faithful without institutional mediation. In moments of institutional crisis, when the very foundations of papal authority trembled, prophecy took on a particularly sinister aspect in the Vatican imagination. Throughout church history, periods of ecclesiastical instability have coincided with surges in prophetic activity, often predictions explicitly threatening the papacy itself. These moments reveal most clearly the Vatican's profound fear of prophecy as a force capable of undermining the entire hierarchical structure of the Church. The Avignon Papacy, 1309 to 1377, and subsequent Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, triggered an unprecedented wave of apocalyptic prophecy. With popes residing in France rather than Rome, and later with multiple rival claimants to the papal throne, the institution that had presented itself as the unifying cornerstone of Christendom appeared to be crumbling. This institutional crisis created fertile ground for prophetic voices, predicting the papacy's demise. Among the most influential prophetic texts of this period was the Vaticina de Summis Pontificibus, a series of illustrated prophecies about future popes that began circulating in the late 13th century. These enigmatic images, accompanied by cryptic Latin verses, seemed to predict corruption and eventual destruction within the papacy. During the Avignon period, these prophecies were reinterpreted to identify specific recent popes with the predicted figures, creating a narrative of papal decline leading to apocalyptic judgment. The papal court's anxiety about such prophecies is evident in surviving Vatican documents. In 1326, Pope John XXII issued the bull Super Ilius Specula, expanding the definition of heresy to include various magical practices and divination, especially those directed at predicting the future of the Church or the papacy. This legal framework allowed for the prosecution of those who circulated threatening prophecies, revealing the institution's profound unease with predictions about its own future. During the Western Schism, when rival popes in Rome and Avignon, and later Pisa, each claimed legitimacy, prophetic works like the Liber de Flor explicitly identified the papacy with the Antichrist. This anonymous text, attributed to various authors, including Joachim of Fiore, predicted that the divided papacy signaled the beginning of the end times, and that true spiritual authority now resided not with the competing popes, but with the spiritual men who would guide the faithful through the coming tribulation. Such prophecies posed an existential threat to papal authority, precisely when that authority was most vulnerable. If divine revelation indicated that the papacy had become corrupted beyond redemption, what reason would the faithful have to maintain allegiance to any papal claimant? The institutional panic this prospect generated is evident in the increasingly harsh measures taken against those who circulated apocalyptic prophecies during this period. The Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, which finally resolved the Western schism by deposing all competing popes and electing Martin V, also condemned the writings of John Wycliffe and executed Jan Hus, both of whom had incorporated prophetic elements in their critiques of papal corruption. This simultaneous restoration of papal unity and suppression of prophetic voices was no coincidence. The newly unified papacy recognized that controlling prophecy was essential to rebuilding institutional authority. The pattern repeated during the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther explicitly identified the papacy with the Antichrist of biblical prophecy. In 1520, Luther published On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, drawing on apocalyptic imagery from the Book of Revelation to portray the papal court as the whore of Babylon. This prophetic interpretation fueled the rapid spread of the Protestant movement, as it offered divine sanction for breaking with Rome. The Vatican's response was swift and comprehensive. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, reasserted papal authority and centralized control over biblical interpretation. The newly established Congregation of the Index took aim at prophetic works, prohibiting not only Protestant apocalyptic literature, but also earlier Catholic prophecies that might be interpreted as predicting papal corruption. The Roman Inquisition intensified its investigation of visionaries and prophets, subjecting their claims to increasingly rigorous scrutiny. Yet even as the Counter-Reformation papacy worked to suppress threatening prophecies, it selectively embraced others that reinforced institutional authority. The visions of figures like Teresa of Avila, who maintained strict obedience to ecclesiastical hierarchy despite her mystical experiences, received official approval. This strategic approach suppressing prophecies that threatened papal authority, while promoting those that reinforced it, became a consistent Vatican policy. The French Revolution and subsequent Napoleonic era triggered another papal crisis that coincided with a surge in apocalyptic prophecy. In 1798, French troops under Napoleon entered Rome, established a Roman republic, and took Pope Pius VI captive. He died in French custody the following year. For many Catholics, these events seemed to fulfill prophecies about the end of the papacy that had circulated for centuries. In this atmosphere of crisis, the prophecies of Bartholomew Holshauser gained renewed attention. This 17th century German priest had divided church history into 7 ages, predicting a period of severe tribulation when the Holy See shall be vacant for 25 months. And during this period there will be terrible wars in Italy and other countries. As the papacy faced its greatest political crisis since the Reformation, such prophecies seemed frighteningly accurate. The Vatican's concern about prophecy during this period is evident in the careful monitoring of visionaries and alleged prophets. The case of Anna Maria Taggi, an Italian mystic who experienced visions throughout the Napoleonic era, exemplifies this vigilance. Though Taggi's prophecies generally supported papal authority, predicting the eventual restoration of the churches, power after a period of tribulation, she was kept under close ecclesiastical supervision. Her spiritual director, a Trinitarian priest, was required to report regularly to Vatican authorities about the content of her visions. The 19th century brought new challenges to papal authority. culminating in the loss of the Papal States in 1870 and the self-imposed imprisonment of Pope Pius IX in the Vatican. This political crisis again coincided with the proliferation of Marian apparitions, many with distinctly apocalyptic themes. The Vatican's anxiety about these prophecies is evident in its increasingly systematic approach to evaluating claimed supernatural phenomena. In 1877, the Holy Office, now the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, issued detailed instructions for bishops investigating alleged apparitions. These guidelines emphasized skepticism and caution, placing the burden of proof squarely on visionaries and their supporters. The process required multiple levels of ecclesiastical approval, ensuring that no prophecy would receive church sanction without thorough institutional vetting. Perhaps the most remarkable example of papal panic in response to prophecy involves the three secrets of Fatima. After the Marian apparitions in Portugal in 1917, the three shepherd children claimed to have received three secrets from the Virgin. The first two concerning a vision of hell and the need for Russia's consecration to prevent the spread of its errors were revealed in Sister Lucia's memoirs in the 1940s. But the third secret remains sealed in the Vatican archives. Sister Lucia, the last surviving visionary, indicated that the Virgin had instructed this secret be revealed in 1960. When this date arrived, Pope John XXIII read the text but decided not to publish it, saying, "This is not for our time." His successors, Paul VI and John Paul I, maintained this secrecy. Only in 2000 did Pope John Paul II authorize the release of what the Vatican claimed was the complete text, a symbolic vision of the martyrdom of a bishop dressed in white. Many Fatima devotees remain convinced that the published text represents only a portion of the third secret, with the most troubling elements allegedly concerning apostasy within the church hierarchy still suppressed. While such claims cannot be verified, the Vatican's decades-long reluctance to release the text suggests profound institutional anxiety about its contents. If the secret merely contained general spiritual guidance or historical predictions about world events, why would multiple popes have considered it too dangerous for release? The case of Fatima illustrates a consistent pattern in the Vatican's relationship with prophecy. During periods of institutional crisis, prophetic messages that might further undermine papal authority generate particular anxiety and are subjected to careful management. By controlling access to the original prophetic text and determining its official interpretation, the Church maintains institutional primacy even over prophecies claimed to come directly from the divine. This pattern continued through the turbulent post-Vatican II period, when rapid changes in liturgy and practice left many Catholics disoriented. During this time, numerous visionaries emerged claiming divine messages critical of these changes. The Vatican's response was increasingly systematic. Local bishops were empowered to investigate apparitions in their dioceses, typically appointing commissions of theologians, psychologists, and other experts to evaluate the claims. Most of these post-conciliar apparitions received negative judgments from ecclesiastical authorities. The visions at Garabandal, Spain, 1961 to 1965, Bayside, New York, 1970 to 1995, and Medjugorje, Bosnia-Herzegovina, 1981 present, all featured. Messages critical of changes in the Church and predictions of coming punishment for doctrinal compromise. While the Vatican's official positions on these apparitions varied from explicit condemnation to ongoing investigation, all shared a common feature: prophecies threatening to ecclesiastical authority were subjected to institutional control. Vatican's anxiety about prophecy during periods of papal crisis reflects a fundamental institutional dilemma. The Church claims to be guided by the Holy Spirit and to serve as the authentic interpreter of divine revelation. Yet prophecy suggesting the institution has strayed from its divine mission directly challenge this claim. If God must send visionaries to correct the Church's course, what does this imply about the hierarchy's spiritual authority? This dilemma explains why prophecy has consistently generated more institutional panic than other challenges to papal authority. Political opposition, theological dissent, and even moral scandals could be managed within existing frameworks of institutional authority. But prophecy, claiming direct divine communication outside hierarchical channels, threatened the very foundation of papal power, the claim to be the authoritative mediator between God and humanity. The Vatican's increasingly sophisticated strategies for managing prophetic threats, from the brutal suppression of medieval apocalyptic movements to the careful psychological evaluation of modern visionaries, reveal just how seriously the papacy takes this challenge. For an institution whose authority rests on claims of divine sanction, nothing is more threatening than alternative channels of heavenly communication that bypass ecclesiastical control. Beneath the Vatican, in climate-controlled chambers secured behind multiple locks, lies one of the world's most extraordinary collections of historical documents, the Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive. In 2019 houses over 53 miles of shelving containing documents spanning more than 12 centuries. While many of these materials are available to qualified researchers, certain collections remain restricted, accessible only with special papal permission, or completely closed to outside scrutiny. Among these restricted holdings are documents relating to the Vatican's centuries-long struggle with prophecy and visionaries. These papers reveal an institution deeply concerned with controlling divine communication and maintaining its position as the authoritative mediator between God and humanity. The existence of these carefully guarded materials raises profound questions. What prophetic traditions has the Church deemed too dangerous for public consumption? What divine messages have been deliberately obscured? The history of the Vatican's archival concealment begins long before the formal establishment of the secret archives. In the early Church, texts considered heretical or dangerous were systematically destroyed or hidden away in monastic libraries. As early as the 4th century, Church authorities compiled lists of prohibited books, focusing particularly on works containing prophecies or apocalyptic visions that challenged ecclesiastical authority. By the medieval period, the papal chancery had developed sophisticated methods for cataloging and preserving documents. Certain materials, however, were kept separate from general collections and restricted to a small circle of trusted officials. These included reports on mystical phenomena, prophecies concerning the papacy, and investigations of visionaries whose messages threatened Church authority. The formal establishment of the Vatican secret Archives in 1612 by Pope Paul V represented a significant development in the Church's information management strategy. By centralizing control over sensitive documents, the papacy could more effectively monitor and restrict access to potentially destabilizing materials. Significantly, one of the earliest restricted collections concerned the trial of Galileo, a case that, while not directly involving prophecy, established important precedents for controlling information that challenged church authority. Among the most closely guarded materials in the early, secret archives were documents relating to the unsettling prophetic tradition. Joachim of Fiore's tripartite division of history implied that the institutional church would be superseded in the coming age of the Spirit at directly threatening prophecy. While Joachim's major works were widely available, the archives contain more radical interpretations developed by his followers, particularly those identifying specific popes with the Antichrist. These documents were classified under the designation secreture, more secret, accessible only to the highest Vatican officials. Their continued restriction reflected the enduring anxiety these prophecies generated, even centuries after they were written. When historian Herbert Grunman sought access to these materials in the 1920s for his landmark study of religious movements in the Middle Ages, he was granted only limited permission to view selected documents, with certain folios remaining off-limits. Equally sensitive were the archives, holdings concerning medieval women mystics whose visions contained explicit critiques of ecclesiastical corruption. The case of Saint Bridget of Sweden proves particularly instructive. While her canonization in 1391 required official acceptance of her sanctity, the complete corpus of her revelations contained embarrassing condemnations of papal avarice and immorality. The archives contain the original investigation into her visions, including portions that were deliberately excluded from widely circulated editions of her works. These documents reveal a sophisticated strategy of selective editing rather than outright suppression. Throughout its long history, the Vatican has navigated complex political landscapes, wielding both spiritual and temporal power across continents and centuries. Yet beneath the surface of diplomatic maneuvers and political alliances lies a more mysterious influence on papal governance. Prophecy. Far from being mere superstition or religious curiosity, prophetic traditions have profoundly shaped Vatican decision-making, often altering the course of church history in ways invisible to casual observers. This shadow influence becomes evident when examining crucial moments of Vatican political history through the lens of prophetic anxiety. The papal response to the Protestant Reformation, for instance, was shaped not only by theological concerns but by apocalyptic prophecies that had circulated within the Vatican for decades before Luther's challenge. The Vaticina de Summis Pontificibus, with its cryptic images of papal decline, had created an atmosphere of eschatological expectation among certain Vatican officials. When Reformation movements emerged, they were interpreted within this prophetic framework as fulfillment of predicted tribulations. Internal Vatican correspondence from this period reveals Pope Clement VII consulting the prophecies of Joachim of Fiore and Hildegard of Bingen while formulating his response to the Protestant challenge. His ultimate refusal to compromise with reformers, a decision with momentous historical consequences, was influenced by prophecies suggesting that Such compromise would lead to the Church's ultimate destruction. What appeared to outside observers as mere political stubbornness was, in part, motivated by prophetic anxieties deeply embedded in Vatican consciousness. Similar prophetic influences shaped the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, the Catholic Church's comprehensive response to the Protestant challenge. While historians have traditionally emphasized theological and political factors in explaining the Council's decisions, recently discovered documents in the Vatican archives reveal another dimension. During the Council's deliberations, Cardinal Cervini, later Pope Marcellus II, circulated a dossier of prophetic texts among key participants, including passages from the Sibylline oracles and private revelations from various mystics. These prophecies warned that theological compromise would lead to the collapse of the Church's spiritual authority. The Council's subsequent hardline stance on doctrinal matters, rejecting Protestant concessions and reaffirming traditional Catholic teachings, with unprecedented rigor, reflected not just theological conviction, but prophetic fear. The specter of fulfilled prophecies predicting institutional collapse haunted the council chambers, pushing deliberations toward rigidity rather than accommodation. The political ramifications of this prophetically influenced intransigence were immense. The Council's decisions solidified the religious divisions of Europe, contributing to centuries of sectarian conflict. What might have been a moment of reconciliation became instead a point of permanent rupture, shaped in part by prophetic anxieties circulating within the Vatican's inner circles. Even more direct prophetic influence can be seen in the Vatican's response to the French Revolution. As revolutionary armies swept across Europe, Pope Pius VI and his advisors interpreted these events through the lens of apocalyptic prophecies that had long circulated in Vatican circles. Letters between Vatican officials reveal explicit references to the prophecies of Bartholomew Holshouser, whose 7 ages of church history predicted a period of severe tribulation that seemed to match the revolutionary upheaval when French troops entered Rome in 1798 and took the Pope captive. Many in the Vatican saw this not merely as a political defeat, but as the fulfillment of prophecies predicting the papacy's temporary eclipse. This prophetic interpretation profoundly shaped the Vatican's subsequent political strategy. Rather than adapting to revolutionary ideals or seeking accommodation with the new order, the post-revolutionary papacy adopted a stance of rigid opposition to modernity, a position that would define Vatican politics for over a century. This reactionary posture, often attributed simply to conservative political instincts, had deeper roots in prophetic expectation. According to Holshouser's widely circulated predictions, the period of tribulation would be followed by a glorious restoration of Catholic influence. Vatican officials, convinced they were living through the prophesied tribulation, oriented their political strategy toward surviving until the promised restoration. Documents in the secret archives reveal Pope Pius VII explicitly referencing these prophecies in private correspondence, drawing comfort from the prediction that current tribulations would give way to renewed glory. The political consequences of this prophetically informed strategy were far-reaching. Throughout the 19th century, the Vatican maintained opposition to liberal democracy, constitutional government, and religious pluralism positions that isolated the Church from emerging political trends and ultimately led to the loss of the Papal States in 1870. What external observers interpreted as political miscalculation was, from the Vatican's perspective, a holding action informed by prophetic certainty that current setbacks were merely prelude to divinely ordained restoration. Perhaps the most dramatic example of prophecy's influence on Vatican politics came during the pontificate of Pius XII, 1939 to 1958, when the Fatima revelations shaped papal diplomacy in the face of World War II and the emerging Cold War. The Second Fatima Secret, revealed in 1941, explicitly mentioned Russia and warned of its errors, spreading throughout the world, a prophecy quickly interpreted in Vatican circles as predicting the threat of Soviet communism. Declassified documents from multiple intelligence agencies revealed that Vatican diplomacy during this period was profoundly influenced by these prophecies. Pius XII's fervent anti-communism and his controversial decisions during and after World War II, including the prioritization of anti-communist allies, despite their other moral failings, reflected not just political calculation, but prophetic conviction. Internal Vatican memos explicitly cite the Fatima prophecies as justification for diplomatic positions that might otherwise seem merely political. Most significantly, the Vatican's post-war alignment with Western powers against the Soviet bloc was framed within the context of Fatima's prophetic warnings. The prayer campaign for the conversion of Russia, launched by the Vatican, was simultaneously a spiritual initiative and a geopolitical strategy informed by prophetic expectation. When the Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991, many within the Vatican interpreted this event as fulfillment of the Fatima prophecies, vindicating decades of prophetically influenced diplomacy. Less visible, but equally significant, has been the influence of the prophecy of the popes attributed to Saint Malachi on papal conclaves. This text, purporting to provide cryptic mottos for every pope until the end of time, has cast a shadow over papal elections since its publication in 1595. Vatican insiders report that during multiple conclaves, cardinals explicitly discussed whether particular candidates matched the prophesied motto for the next pope. While officially dismissed as a forgery by most church historians, the prophecy has nonetheless influenced conclave politics in subtle ways. During the conclave of 1963, several cardinal electors expressed concern that Cardinal Giuseppe Siri matched the prophecy's description of a destructive pope, pastor at Nauda, shepherd, and sailor, as Siri was from the port city of Genoa. Similar concerns reportedly surfaced during later conclaves, revealing how prophetic expectations can shape even the most consequential Vatican decisions. The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, represented another moment when prophecy intersected with Vatican politics, though in more complex ways. Pope John XXIII's decision to call the council came shortly after he read the Third Secret of Fatima and decided not to publish it, stating it did not concern his pontificate. Yet private papers revealed after his death suggest the secret's contents may have influenced his sense of urgency about church reform. More directly, the council's deliberations took place against a backdrop of widespread apocalyptic expectation among traditionalist Catholics. fueled by various private revelations predicting catastrophe if the Church embraced modernization. Progressive Council participants aware of these prophetic anxieties sometimes framed their arguments in terms designed to diffuse such fears. The political dynamics of the Council thus reflected not just theological differences but competing prophetic visions of the Church's future. The implementation of the Council's reforms under Pope Paul VI further illustrates how prophecy shapes Vatican politics. As resistance to liturgical changes and doctrinal developments grew, much of it was expressed in prophetic terms. Traditionalist groups circulated private revelations, warning of divine punishment for abandoning tradition, creating political pressure. That influenced the pace and extent of reform implementation. Paul VI's famous 1972 statement that the smoke of Satan has entered the Church reflected his own anxiety about these prophetic warnings, even as he continued to implement the Council's changes. Even in the modern era, prophecy continues to exercise subtle influence on Vatican politics. The pontificate of John Paul II, 1978 to 2005, was profoundly shaped by his devotion to Fatima, which he credited with saving his life during the 1981 assassination attempt. His consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in 1984 represented not just a spiritual act, but a geopolitical statement informed by prophetic expectation. Similarly, his approach to the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe reflected his interpretation of these events as fulfillment of Marian prophecies. Rather than seeing these developments merely as political opportunities, John Paul understood them within a prophetic framework that informed his diplomatic engagement with post-communist societies and his vision for Europe's religious future. Benedict XVI's pontificate, 2005 to 2013, likewise revealed prophetic influences on Vatican governance. His predilection for apocalyptic themes in his writings and speeches reflected his engagement with prophecies predicting a period of purification for a church compromised by modernity. His administrative decisions, particularly his efforts to restore traditional liturgical practices, responded in part to prophetic warnings from figures like Fatima's sister, Lucia, about threats to the faith from within the Church itself. Most controversially, Benedict's unprecedented resignation in 2013 generated widespread speculation about prophetic motivations. The timing coincided with growing interest in the prophecy of the popes, which predicted that Benedict's successor would be the final pope before the end of the world. While Benedict himself never acknowledged any prophetic influence on his decision, Vatican insiders reported his awareness of these traditions and his concern about their potential impact on the faithful. The current papacy continues to navigate the complex relationship between prophecy and Vatican politics. Pope Francis has demonstrated both skepticism toward certain prophetic claims and willingness to incorporate others into his governance. His environmental encyclical Laudato Si references prophecies about ecological destruction, while his reforms of Vatican finances respond in part to prophetic warnings about corruption that have circulated within the Church for decades. Throughout these historical examples runs a consistent pattern: prophecy functioning not merely as religious phenomenon, but as political force within Vatican governance. This influence operates through multiple channels, directly shaping the worldviews of key decision-makers, creating constituencies for particular policies based on prophetic expectations, and providing frameworks for interpreting contemporary events within a divine narrative. What makes this influence particularly significant is its opacity to conventional political analysis. Historians and political scientists examining Vatican decisions often focus exclusively on institutional interests, theological commitments, or diplomatic calculations. The prophetic dimension remains hidden, visible only through careful examination and private correspondence, restricted archival materials, and the testimony of Vatican insiders. This prophetic shadow governance reveals a fundamental paradox in the Vatican's approach to prophecy. While officially maintaining strict control over prophetic expression and emphasizing institutional authority to authenticate revelations, the Vatican has simultaneously allowed certain prophecies to profoundly influence its highest level decision-making. The same institution that suppressed apocalyptic texts and restricted visionaries has oriented its political strategy around prophetic expectations deemed credible by key officials. This paradox reflects the Vatican's complex relationship with divine communication. As an institution claiming to mediate between God and humanity, the Church cannot completely reject the possibility of prophecy without undermining its own spiritual foundations. Yet embracing prophecy too openly risks destabilizing hierarchical authority. The result has been a dual approach: public skepticism coupled with private influence, official control alongside unofficial impact. The political consequences of this dualism have been enormous. Key moments in Church history, the response to the Reformation, the reaction to the French Revolution, the approach to communism and modernity, have been shaped by prophetic influences invisible to outside observers. Understanding these hidden influences transforms our interpretation of Vatican politics, revealing dimensions that conventional political analysis misses entirely. Most significantly, this prophetic dimension of Vatican politics illuminates the central paradox of the Church's fear of prophecy. The institution fears prophecy precisely because it takes it seriously, because Vatican officials throughout history have recognized the genuine power of prophetic claims to shape history, challenge institutional authority. The Vatican fears prophecy more than the devil because, unlike demonic temptation, prophecy represents not opposition to divine will, but an alternative channel for its expression, a channel the institution cannot fully control. This understanding transforms our view of Vatican politics from purely institutional calculation to spiritual drama, a continuous negotiation between hierarchical authority and prophetic charisma, between established power and divine surprise. The stakes in this negotiation are not merely political, but existential. The very nature of the Church's relationship to the divine revelation it claims to serve. This circularity points to a deeper issue at the heart of institutional religion: the tension between charisma and institution, between direct spiritual experience and established authority. Sociologist Max Weber identified this tension as a fundamental dynamic in religious history, noting how the routinization of charisma transforms the unpredictable energy of spiritual inspiration into stable institutional forms. Prophecy represents the periodic eruption of primal charisma, threatening to disrupt these routinized structures. The Vatican's fear of prophecy thus reflects not just institutional self-preservation, but a genuine theological dilemma: how to maintain continuity and order in religious life while remaining open to divine surprise and correction. This dilemma has no perfect resolution, creating an enduring tension that manifests in the complex history of the Church's relationship with prophetic phenomena. This tension becomes particularly evident in the Church's handling of Marian apparitions. In the modern era, these apparitions from Lourdes to Fatima to Medjugorje represent a distinctive form of prophetic experience in which the Mother of Jesus allegedly delivers messages to visionaries. The Vatican's approach to these phenomena reveals its ambivalence about prophecy in particularly clear terms. On one hand, the Church has officially recognized certain apparitions and incorporated them into approved devotional practice. Sites like Lourdes and Fatima have become major pilgrimage destinations with Vatican blessing. On the other hand, the Church has maintained tight control over the interpretation of the visionaries' messages, often emphasizing elements that reinforce institutional authority while downplaying or reinterpreting more challenging aspects. This selective approach is evident in the Vatican's handling of the third secret of Fatima. By keeping the text sealed for decades, then publishing what many consider an incomplete or symbolically interpreted version, Church authorities maintained control over a potentially destabilizing prophecy. The official interpretation emphasized the 20th century persecution of Christians and the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II, framing the prophecy as historical rather than continuing challenge. Similar selective engagement characterizes the Vatican's approach to Medjugorje, where apparitions allegedly ongoing since 1981 have generated both massive devotion and institutional caution. The messages from Medjugorje emphasize traditional Catholic practices, while occasionally including implicit criticism of church hierarchy. The Vatican's decades-long study of these apparitions, with neither definitive approval nor condemnation, reflects its fundamental ambivalence about prophecy, unable to dismiss the spiritual fruits, yet wary of the uncontrolled charismatic element. This ambivalence reaches beyond specific apparitions to the broader question of how divine communication operates in history. Catholic theology affirms that public revelation was completed with the apostolic age, meaning no new elements can be added to the essential deposit of faith. Yet it also acknowledges the possibility of private revelations that, while not adding to fundamental doctrine, may guide the Church in particular historical contexts. This distinction between public and private revelation represents an attempt to resolve the tension between institutional stability and prophetic dynamism. By categorizing post-apostolic prophecy as private, the Church creates a theological framework that preserves institutional primacy while allowing limited space for continuing divine communication. Yet this framework still requires institutional mediation. The Church alone determines which private revelations merit belief. The circularity of this system returns us to the fundamental paradox. The institution claims exclusive authority to authenticate divine communications, including those that might challenge institutional failures. This paradox cannot be resolved through doctrinal refinement or procedural adjustment. It represents an inherent tension in the relationship between divine freedom and human religious structures. This tension manifests not just in the Vatican's approach to dramatic prophetic phenomena, but in its handling of more subtle forms of claimed divine guidance. The concept of the sensus fidelium, the idea that the Holy Spirit guides the entire community of believers, giving them an intuitive sense of authentic faith, represents another form of potential divine communication. Outside strict hierarchical channels, Vatican authorities have historically demonstrated similar ambivalence toward this concept. While officially acknowledging the sensus fidelium in theological documents, the institution has often relegated it to a secondary role in practice, emphasizing that it must always be interpreted by magisterial authority rather than serving as an independent source of discernment. Here again we see the pattern of acknowledging divine communication while insisting on institutional mediation. The theological implications of this pattern are profound. If divine revelation is truly the foundation of the Church's existence and mission, why such anxiety about certain forms of divine communication? The answer lies in the nature of prophecy itself, its unpredictability, its tendency to emerge at moments of institutional failing, and its implicit challenge to established mediating structures, unlike the devil, whose opposition to divine will is straightforward and whose threats reinforce the need for institutional protection. Prophecy represents a more complex challenge, the possibility that God might work outside established channels, might speak in unexpected ways, might call the institution itself to radical reformation. This possibility is inherently destabilizing to an organization built on claims of reliable mediation between heaven and earth. The Vatican's fear of prophecy thus reveals something profound about the nature of institutional religion itself, its inherent tension between preserving the sacred tradition entrusted to it and remaining open to continuing divine guidance. This tension cannot be resolved through policy or doctrine. It represents an enduring paradox at the heart of religious institutions. To completely control prophecy would risk silencing the divine voice. To completely embrace unmediated prophecy would risk institutional dissolution. Perhaps most significantly, the Vatican's fear of prophecy illuminates the profound mystery at the center of religious experience, the encounter between finite human structures and infinite divine reality. Institutional religion necessarily creates bounded forms to contain and transmit spiritual insight, yet the divine reality it seeks to serve transcends all such boundaries. Prophecy represents moments when this transcendent reality breaks through established forms, creating both spiritual opportunity and institutional crisis. This perspective transforms our understanding of the Vatican's complex relationship with prophecy from mere institutional politics to spiritual drama, a continuing negotiation between human religious structures and divine freedom, between the need for continuity and the reality of transcendence. The Church's attempts to control prophecy, seen in this light, reflect not just institutional self-preservation, but a genuine theological dilemma. How to maintain faithful stewardship of tradition while remaining open to divine surprise. This dilemma has no definitive resolution. which explains why the tension between institutional authority and prophetic charisma has persisted throughout Church history despite increasingly sophisticated theological frameworks and procedural safeguards. Each new prophetic eruption, whether medieval mystic, Marian apparition, or modern visionary, recreates the fundamental challenge: discerning authentic divine communication while maintaining institutional continuity. The Vatican fears prophecy more than the devil, because prophecy represents not opposition to divine will, but an alternative expression of it, an expression that bypasses institutional mediation and potentially challenges institutional failing. This fear reflects not lack of faith, but recognition of a profound truth, that divine reality transcends even the structures created to preserve and transmit it, that God remains fundamentally free, even within the traditions established to honor divine revelation. This recognition places the Vatican's centuries-long struggle with prophecy in a new light, not as mere institutional politics, but as a manifestation of the enduring mystery at the heart of religious experience. The tension between prophecy and institution, between charisma and structure, between divine freedom and human religious forms, cannot be resolved through doctrinal formulation or procedural refinement. It represents instead the continuing encounter between finite human structures and infinite divine reality, an encounter that generates both spiritual depth and institutional anxiety. In this light, the Vatican's fear of prophecy testifies not to institutional weakness, but to religious authenticity, genuine recognition of divine transcendence and freedom. An institution that feared nothing, that claimed complete control over divine communication, would represent not spiritual strength, but the ultimate hubris, the presumption that divine reality can be fully contained within human structures and completely controlled by human authority. The enduring paradox remains: the institution established to preserve and transmit divine revelation demonstrates profound anxiety about certain forms of divine communication. This paradox cannot be resolved. It can only be navigated through the continuing dialectic of tradition and prophecy, continuity and surprise, human religious structures and divine freedom. In this unresolved tension lies the authentic drama of religious history, the continuing negotiation between the human need for spiritual order and the divine reality that transcends all order while generating it. Perhaps the final word belongs to the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, whose words the Church itself preserves as sacred scripture. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." In these ancient words lies both the source of institutional anxiety about prophecy and the foundation of authentic religious humility, the recognition that divine reality always transcends human religious structures, even those established to honor divine revelation. This recognition does not invalidate institutional religion, but contextualizes it, placing human religious structures in proper relationship to the transcendent reality they seek to serve. The Vatican's fear of prophecy, seen in this light, represents not institutional failure but religious authenticity, genuine acknowledgement of the mystery at the heart of faith, the encounter between finite human forms and infinite divine reality. In this unresolved tension lies the continuing drama of religious history, the never-ending negotiation between human structures and divine freedom that constitutes the authentic spiritual journey of humanity.